This is not a story about baseball. This is a story of conspiracy, of political intrigue, and okay, fine, I suppose it's a story about baseball. But it's more than that. Most importantly, this is the story of why the Montreal Expos no longer exist. After being founded in 1969, the Expos struggled for most of their existence. They lost the majority of their games their first 10 seasons, and only managed to even come close to a division title in the 2 seasons of 1981 and 1994, neither of which quite count, as they were both shortened by strikes by the players for better working conditions. There wasn't even a World Series played in 1994, which is unfortunate because it was the Expos' best season in their history. Needless to say, the Expos' luck wasn't great. In fact, it was horrible. The Expos were never exactly a great team, and rarely even a good team, but they were lovable in their own way. Being the only French-Canadian team in the major leagues meant that they had a flavor all their own, and nobody could take that away from them. Except for when they did. 1995 was the beginning of the end. After stringing together a few decent seasons with an exciting team, they ran out of money and couldn't afford to bring back their core players. After losing the best of their team, some fans just lost interest and attendance waned. The Expos were no longer profitable, and with no history of winning, it didn't look like things were going to improve anytime soon. On top of that, Montreal was in need of a new stadium, but didn't have the funds to support one. Olympic Stadium, the home of the Expos for decades, was rickety and remote, hardly an ideal venue to attract tens of thousands of visitors a day.
In 1986, a piece of the tower fell into the playing field during an Expos game. The team said they would have to play more heads-up baseball from then on.
Gradually, the fans stopped coming and things began looking dismal. The Expos' very presence in the city they called home began to fade. It's around this time I should introduce you to two key players in this story, Bud Selig and Claude Bruchot. Bud Selig was the commissioner of baseball at the time. He had originally gotten involved in the major leagues by bringing the expansion Seattle Pilots to Milwaukee as the Brewers, and decades later found himself as the head honcho of all of baseball. Claude Bruchot was essentially the acting owner of the Montreal Expos, representing a group of investors. Thanks to the Expos' decline and fading footprint in Montreal, many clamored for the Expos to be sold as a smear campaign tore through Bruchot. Selig seemingly had an obsession with bringing Major League Baseball back to Washington, D.C., where it had been gone since the Washington Senators moved to Texas 25 years earlier to become the Rangers. Combine this with the lackluster state of the Expos, and it was no surprise that rumors began to float of Selig and Bruchot conspiring to move the team to D.C. As such, it came as a relief to many fans when in 2001 Brochu was replaced as head of the Expos by an art dealer named Jeffrey Loria. Loria promised to raise the team to its full potential and make Montreal baseball exciting again. He was praised as a potential savior, the man who could single-handedly keep the Expos in Montreal and the spirit of Quebecois baseball alive. It didn't quite work out that way. Loria invested a great deal of his own money in the Expos, leading their payroll to double, and eventually Loria had a 92% controlling interest in the team. With these additional funds, many fans hoped the Expos could build a winning team by signing top-quality players from across the major leagues, but unfortunately, many still didn't want to play in Montreal. A different language was dominant, the team was shaky, and its future remained dim, and the stadium was aging and perhaps even dangerous at this point.
Heads-up baseball.
While Loria had initially made attempts to fund a new stadium, they were flawed designs that ultimately failed due to Loria's refusal to shoulder some of the costs, insisting that the government pay for the majority of his stadium. Even with double the money they had been working with, Montreal failed to make itself an attractive trading destination. Worse, the Expos soon found themselves with even less publicity, as Loria set an excessively high price for the right to carry their TV and radio broadcasts. With no station willing to pay to carry the struggling team, fans could no longer follow them in English except through internet audiocasts, which in 2001 were far from ideal. The Montreal Expos seemed to be fading from existence. Expos fans found themselves ignored further and further, as their team suffered a downward spiral so severe that in November of 2001, the MLB owners voted 28-2 to fold the Montreal Expos and another struggling team, the Minnesota Twins. The writing was on the wall. Laurier sold the team to Major League Baseball itself and fled Montreal, leaving with a legacy as an owner capable of single-handedly destroying a franchise. Immediately after leaving Montreal, Laurier bought the Florida Marlins, bringing everything of value with him and leaving only destruction and chaos in his wake. You could at least pretend to care, Laurier. In 2002, Laurier's minority partners filed a Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act lawsuit against Bud Selig, Jeffrey Laurier, and Major League Baseball. While the lawsuit was unsuccessful, its mere existence speaks volumes to how wronged the Expos were by Laurier's questionable business practices. Many fans assumed that this season would be their team's last. Laurier had managed to leave the Expos in an even worse state than he found them, and the team's fate was now in Selig's hands. Luckily, the vote to fold the Expos and Twins had been forced null by a contract obligation the Twins had, but the Expos were still in a state of freefall. Despite this, the Expos bizarrely managed to remain in reach of a playoff spot for much of 2002, but being owned by a league full of their competitors made it impossible for them to make the trades necessary for a late-season push to the playoffs. While no longer in danger of being folded outright, rumors of relocation out of Montreal were still abound. In 2003, the Expos played 22 of their 81 home games in Puerto Rico in an attempt to increase revenue and expand MLB markets. Oddly enough, they were once again in postseason contention, but yet again having no owner but their own enemies, the Expos were unfairly cheated out of a potential meaningful season. They finished the season 8 games behind the wildcard spot, just out of reach in what would prove to be one of their last chances. 2004 was the Montreal Expos' last season. On September 29, 2004, Major League Baseball announced that the Expos would be moving to Washington, D.C. for the 2005 season. The Expos finished miserably, and they lost their last ever game, capping off 35 years of disappointment before moving to Washington the next year. 15 years after leaving Quebec, the Washington Nationals would finally win a World Series, but their days as the Expos were far behind them. I'll never forget while watching the 2019 World Series, there was a brief shot of a single man standing amongst a sea of Nationals red, wearing an Expos cap. Who was he? Had he followed his team through a decade and a half in another nation, another language, to finally see them win the World Series? Can the Expos finally rest in their grave knowing that they have found success? Today, talk of bringing baseball back to Montreal is popular. Rumors were recently abound that the Tampa Bay Rays could end up splitting their season in Montreal much like the Expos once had in San Juan, and while that plan ended up dead in the water, Montreal is still frequently listed as a possible spot for a potential MLB expansion team to land. Someday, baseball could return to Montreal, but for now, it's lost to time. This is Pivotal, and that's the moral of the story.